but it's really cool to see Superteam Canada start up this grassroots environment for builders to show up, learn about Solana, learn about blockchains. This is basically how we started. I'm not going to dive into our story too much because it's on the internet. You guys can go listen to our podcasts. Today, I actually want to focus on a very specific aspect when it comes to building any startup. One that I think is maybe a little under talked about, but it's really important, and that is how to pivot. And throughout the presentation, I'll try to draw on anecdotes that we went through when building Tensor, the company, just to give you guys a flavor of basically the highs and lows of building a startup, even ones that reach very, very high highs and also very low lows. I want to make this presentation fairly interactive, so if you guys have a question, just shoot up your hand and we can address it on the fly instead of waiting until the very end. All right, so first question for all of you. Who here has heard of Tensor, the NFT marketplace? Oh, wow, okay. That's great to hear. Yeah, so most of you probably know us for our marketplace. It was basically one of the big marketplaces that came out probably last cycle, 2-3 years ago. But this wasn't actually where we first initially started. When we went into that Coliseum hackathon that Simon mentioned, this was actually our first product. So we spent about a couple of weeks, maybe 2-3 weeks, ideating on what me and Ilya would want to build as our first product, and what we would go into the hackathon with. And we came up with this, brilliant idea, I say that sarcastically, of building a NFT pricing oracle. So at the time, NFTs were super hot. DeFi was also super hot. So we thought, hey, NFT plus DeFi is going to happen. And what this means is there will be NFT perps, there will be NFT pool lending protocols, there will be all sorts of DeFi-esque applications and protocols for NFTs. And one of the most fundamental pieces of that is the pricing oracle. TLDR is it provides some price information that's reliable to these protocols on chain so that they can do liquidations, so that they can do the perp math in order to let people trade NFT perps. So we built this in roughly 2 months. Then we started talking to a number of customers, potential customers. TLDR is one protocol paid us. 1.5 protocols said they would pay us if we added this feature. And after we added that feature, they would tell us, hey, if you add this other feature, we'll start paying you. And by the end of that, we had about $500 in revenue per month. For those who don't know, this is not really a success story, but any start. So, this was basically when we decided, hey, I think we either need to drastically change something about how we're approaching this product or our strategy, or we decide to pivot. And so I'm going to list out a couple of things that led to our decision to pivot. And these sort of core principles will also come up later. So the first easy factor in helping us decide to pivot was that the market was terrible. So as I mentioned, we wanted to basically target the NFT x DeFi or NFT-fi market, but it was just way too early. There were a number of very intellectualized blog posts written by I guess thinkers in the space, like think tanks and investors, and that got us really excited. But when you actually started building in the space, you realized that it was way too early. There was basically no customers. No one really cared about this advanced way of trading NFTs. All they wanted to do was buy and sell JPEGs, right? So the market was really bad. So this was a very easy factor to look at for why we would pivot. The second factor was our strategy. Our strategy was pretty bad. So we wanted to build this price oracle, and that meant we were a middleware. For those who are maybe familiar with the smiling curve theory, I'll try to summarize it briefly, but it's this economic theory. I think it was first, the first person who came up with it was the Acer founder. And a lot of people, including Ben Thompson from the Strattree blog post, this famous tech blog post, he also uses it a lot in his material. But the TLDR is that for any given market, there is this like value chain, right? So at the very left end, you have the supply or people who are creating the IP and creating the actual like intellectual property for this market. You might think, NVIDIA would fall into that category. They're creating these very complicated chips that are super valuable and that other people need for building AI models. On the other end, you have people that are as close as possible to the users. So these are people maybe building applications. This might include OpenAI. They're building models on top of NVIDIA, and now they have a front end, ChatGPT, with 1 billion users. They would fall on the other end. Everything in the middle is basically a dead man zone, right? So the reason why it's called smiling curve is the value is very high on the left side, very high on the right side, and it's extremely low in the middle. You're basically a commodity provider. At any point in time, some other competitor can come by because you have no proprietary tech and basically like undercut you. And all of the margin basically goes to zero in the middle. You can imagine in the AI example, this is like API providers who are literally just wrappers on top of, I don't know, some open source model. And all they do is provide you with like cheap infrastructure. But at any point in time, one of these big cloud providers like AWS or GCP can come in with a much better offer, much more reliable, and undercut you to zero. And so we basically fell into this category, right, the middle, where we didn't own the market of NFTs. That was marketplaces like Magic Eden and OpenSea. And we did, or I guess I should say, so this is interesting. Magic Eden and OpenSea, they're both the protocol, so the base layer, where everyone traded their NFTs. But they're also like the front ends where all of these people buy and sell NFTs. So they actually have a piece of both sides. Other examples of supply side companies that did very well were launchpads and creators. They made a ton of money creating these NFTs. So NFT pricing oracle is right in the middle. So our strategy was pretty bad. We didn't really think through this entirely, and we just sort of went in head first. But in hindsight, it was not the best place to be. The third factor, as I alluded to in the previous slide, was our traction in PMS was bad. There was no pull from the market. Customers weren't ripping the product out from us. We had to basically pry teeth and shove the product, push the product in front of people, and only one person ultimately paid us. And that's typically a very bad sign if people aren't, going through hoops to get to your product. So easy pivot. We basically decided within a week or two, once we went around to our last couple of customers, that we needed to get out of this business. Not going to go into the full history of the marketplace, but we ultimately decided hey, we're going to go after the biggest market right now with NFTs. We were still very excited about NFTs and the potential of this market, and we decided to build an NFT marketplace, Tensor. Long story short, we went from 0% market share all the way up until, 70% market share within, give it 7 months. This is pull from the market, right? It's more or less an exponential curve. The market share percentages kind of obfuscate this, but it's more or less an exponential curve up in terms of volume. And so we knew we had something special here. Yep, go for it.
How did you do that?
I could probably have an entire talk about, how do you capture this wave? To put it short, keep trying things. Go to market with something vastly differentiated. In our case, we basically took a very contrarian take, which was OpenSea, Magic Eden, the two biggest players on Ethereum and Solana respectively. They're very geared towards the collector archetype. Their UIs look like eBay, where every single NFT had this giant image. And in order to buy an NFT, I kid you not, you had to click a buy button for every single NFT you wanted to buy. And there was 3 button clicks for every NFT. We said, hey, we noticed that there's this underserved segment in the market, the pro trader, people who are flipping NFTs, within a matter of hours, and they were buying 50 NFTs at once. We decided to build a pro terminal for NFT trading. And so that was the big differentiator that we came to market with. But even then, I don't know if you can see this. So we launched somewhere around July or August of 2022, and we were flat until this pivotal moment towards the end of January, beginning of February. The one thing that happened here was Blur, which was basically sort of our, not clone, but like a similar product to us on Ethereum. They just finished their airdrop. They had their TGE, and a bunch of traders got rich off their airdrop. This is actually one of the superpowers. It's also a double-edged sword of crypto, where if you can lean heavily into being community first and leading into incentives in a healthy way, that is your way to effectively bootstrap a ton of attention and users, especially if you're a nobody. For us, it was really important because we were a marketplace, which meant that we had to both have supply, so people listing their NFTs for sale, and we also needed demand, which was users showing up and buying NFTs. That's really hard traditionally to bootstrap without basically plowing a bunch of like VC money. So Uber, Airbnb, they basically just like raised money like every single year and plowed all of that into incentives to get people to use their product so that they had both supply and demand. In crypto, you can use a token or a promise of a token for that. And so right around this time, we basically had a new points program. We leaned heavily into doing giving back to traders, and that's what sort of caused this initial uptick and the straight up into the right curve.
So for the demand side, you said that when you first pivoted, one of the differentiation was to build a pro trading platform for NFT. And then at what point of the growth curve, when it started to go exponential, how many percentage of the consumers were pro traders? Right? Or they're just they
from our user base or just from the overall market?
From your.
So we actually had, usually you can't really tell. We actually had this toggle on our UI. Some of you might have used it between like a pro mode versus a light mode. So we knew like how many people were using which mode. It was actually 50-50. So initially it was more top heavy. I mean, initially we only had pro mode. So it was 100. Then we introduced light mode. And then it slowly went from 100-0 to 50-50. And actually light mode started to get more users. That being said, most of the volume actually came from the pro users. And that's typically what you would see in a lot of, I would say volume-based crypto applications or protocols, where 80% of the revenue or volume comes from 20% of your users. It's very much a power law distribution.
Okay.
Okay. So yeah, we basically killed it. We had news articles written about us in TechCrunch. We went on bank lists. So it was great, right? Like everything was rosy. Now, I'm going to take a segue here, and I'll sort of get back to the Tensor story. But how many of you have heard of Vector? Okay, amazing. So this was a product we launched towards the end of last year, so 7 months ago. And so you might be asking, like, why did we decide to launch a completely new product under a completely new brand in an entirely new market? In this case, it was for meme coins and tokens. Well, like to cut to the chase, we pivoted again. At some point, we had to ask ourselves the very hard question, hey, is the NFT marketplace going to sustain us and keep us growing as a startup? The most important thing about any startup is you have to keep growing. That is your only moat, if you will. If you stop growing, then the most obvious thing that happens is you have less revenue, or your revenue doesn't keep growing. Team morale starts to go down, and you don't have a sustainable business that can last decades. And so eventually your lifespan, your half-life will expire, and you'll be back at square one. And so we knew at some point we had to make a tough decision of whether or not we would pivot. I'm going to go through the same. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. When were you certain like this was the time to pivot Vector? What pushed you like right now?
Yeah. So the biggest realization, I I'll actually talk about it in the second point here. Maybe I'll just cut to it real quick. Yeah. So to your question, the most obvious point was that the market was not growing. So we had gone to 70% market share quite quickly, right? So the second point here says traction in PMF was great. We were the dominant leader in our market. We had exponential growth. And at a certain point, you can't like grow past 100% market share. Like that can't just go on indefinitely. You know, there's a limit to math. So like there was like really nothing indicating that this was like a failed product in its market. But this last point was what killed it. We were basically the market leader in a market that hadn't grown for probably 1.5 years by the time that we were sitting at 70% market share. And that's really scary, right? Any exciting market with enough activity, if it has the potential to become a $10 billion market, a $1 trillion market, it usually like consistently grows time over time, right? It usually never just stops growing, even if you like have the best product, you have the best user experience, and you have like people like active users using the things in the market every single day. Yeah. So after about 1.5 years, we knew like, hey, if the market's not going to grow, then we have to do something here. Yeah.
When you're at that point, why didn't you just take the entire Tensor brand and platform and like integrate a new project? Why did you completely shift the whole brand, new Twitter account, bright blue, kind of like you completely pivot? So why did you decide to do that as opposed to just like building on top of the Tensor foundation?
Yeah. It's a good question. I don't think there is a black and white answer here. It's not like, okay, it's like we for sure wanted to create this separate brand. This is a decision that we were debating on for quite some time. We ultimately decided to go with a separate brand. One, because the go-to-market would be cleaner. Instead of going to market with, hey, we're still an NFT marketplace, but you can trade meme coins and tokens and all of this stuff on the same platform. No one's going to pay attention, right? People would just think like, oh, it's just NFTs plus tokens, instead of this is the product that I would use for trading tokens and meme coins. The second thing is, we kind of like knew that the market wasn't strictly overlapping. There were a lot of users that were trading meme coins that weren't necessarily NFT traders, and the overlap wasn't that big. It would make sense to use the same brand if overlap was basically 1-to-1. All NFT traders were basically meme coin traders and vice versa, but that wasn't the case based on what we saw. And so it didn't really matter if we used the same brand. We weren't going to get any compounding advantage from that. And so, TLDR, like it's a cleaner story to go to market with.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Has it been working, Vector?
Yeah, so you're like preempting my next slides. This was what happened shortly after we launched Vector. If you guys can see on the chart, we basically reached a peak of $25 million, $26 million in volume per day. And the entire NFT market at the time on Solana, actually, is this on Solana? No, it's actually across Ethereum and Solana. Solana's even like, I think it's 1/10 of that, was $15 million. So in a single day, we were basically doing more volume than the entire market we were in before. Yes.
If you could answer this, on the day that Vector has 25 million in volume, what would be the revenue for Vector?
Yeah, so we were charging 1%. So to contextualize these numbers, it would obviously be disingenuous if we were charging like 0.01% fees on Vector and 2% on Vector or on Tensor. We were actually charging 1% on Vector, right? So these are comparable volume numbers. And so we would take 1% of 25 million, so that's 250K in revenue.
Per day?
Per day.
At peak.
Yeah. Go ahead.
And you said at the Solana Snapshot conference that you would not have launched Vector without an app. So for us that's trying to launch products, can you give a breakdown of how much revenues came from iOS app and Google app? Is it that important to launch that Or can you just do like a web app or just desktop and be good
Yes,
enough?
that's a really great question. It depends. It really depends on your market and the user segment you're going after. For us, we didn't actually want to go after pros this time with Vector. We wanted to go after more of a retail user because we saw this gap in the market for a mobile token trading app. Before like all of these meme coin trading apps came out, there was Dex Screener on your phone, which doesn't let you trade. And there was Phantom, which lets you trade, but has like really bad discovery token trading UX, right? We basically wanted to combine the two, and that was a gap we saw. We did a bunch of iteration actually in private beta, and we actually appended on the social thesis as well. But it ultimately came down to the gap that we identified in the market, and we felt strongly that there was a big enough user group that wasn't being served at the moment with existing meme coin products. So the existing meme coin products at the time, there were actually 3 or 4 different meme coin terminal desktop apps, right? We didn't want to compete in a red ocean. We wanted to basically find some emptiness in the market and try to be the dominant player there. So I think it really depends. If you're going after more retail, especially if you're going after non-crypto natives, then I think you have to be at mobile. You have to, have a lot or email login. You can't just like tell them to write down a seed phrase because no one's going to do that if they're not crypto natives. Go ahead.
How important do you feel the social aspects of Vector were for the amount of growth and success you've achieved with the app?
It was probably the most. So this goes back to differentiation, right? So when we decided to work on Vector, we actually didn't have that social thesis at all. We just said Dex Screener plus Phantom on your phone. That's it. So we built that thing in 2 months. We launched our private beta with like 50, 100 people. And basically none of them came back the next day and used it, right? So that was a pretty big indicator that we needed to iterate on it before we could launch this. We ultimately went down this, idea maze, and we came to the social angle. And that's when we saw people actually start using the product over Phantom, over Dex Screener, over, Photon. Axiom wasn't around at the time, but Photon inside Phantom. And so we saw that as like, okay, this is the thing that we need to go after. So I would say it's probably like 80, 90% of how we saw all of this initial momentum. Go ahead.
Can I ask a question? So basically, I just want to know like how you started, like when you first started, right? You not have investor money yet. So but you also need money to pay developer or money to pay yourself. And like and at that time when you started, I think you are not sure this project gonna work too, right? So basically, how you overcome all of that until like you get your first investment?
Yeah. Don't hire anyone. In theory, you as a founding team, you and your co-founders should be fully capable of building the product. So that's one thing. In terms of paying yourself, it really depends on your circumstances, right? If you're fortunate enough to have saved a bunch of money, then maybe you live off that. You literally live off of ramen and try to get to a point where you can raise money with your co-founders. Or like worst case scenario is you moonlight, where you maybe do a bit of contracting on the side, or I wouldn't recommend this, but like you might have a full-time job while building this on the side at night until you get it to a point where you can raise money. And then in terms of like paying for all of the costs associated with building any app, there's AWS credits. So I think you can find places online that will give you like $10,000 of AWS credits, and that will basically pay for all of your. And a lot of like these SaaS plus cloud providers, they'll give you credits for your startup for free. So that's how you pay for like all of your expenses. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So there are companies who give you credit for you start a tech company.
There are AWS and all of these cloud providers. They basically have like these startup programs. They'll give you free money to use their technologies.
So just one more question. So when you start Tensor, do you at that time think maybe you are not gonna make it? Maybe it's not gonna work, and like find that uncertainty, like do you have to prepare for that? Like what if it doesn't work?
Yes. I would be shocked if any large successful company hasn't had moments where at some point, the founding team said, hey, this is not going to work. Let's just quit. We had that moment basically, right around here, actually. Yeah, right around here. For those who are familiar, this was like when FTX happened, right? FTX blew up. Solana went to $8. Everyone basically gave up on Solana. Some of our close, friends and investors said, "Hey, what if you guys pivoted out of Solana and went to ETH or went to some other chain?" And we seriously considered like, yeah, maybe it's time for us to ramp up. But we basically had one last experiment we wanted to run, which was, what if we leaned into incentives, even though we didn't want to, because we wanted people to use the product for itself. What if we leaned into incentives hard and give it one last shot and see if our market share can even get to 10%. So we ran that experiment. We got really lucky, and that's the thing with startups is that there is a decent amount of luck involved. Like it's not a science. It's mostly science, but a lot of it is art, and you just have to get lucky by trying a bunch of things. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Hypothetically, if say NFT volumes pick back up again, do you foresee a sort of pivot back to Tensor?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think it depends on what happens with NFTs. Like, if it is something that we think, well, one, like the NFT marketplace is still running, right? So we've
It's not a true pivot in the sense that you didn't abandon the project; it's still running, it's still making revenue. Right?
Yeah. If we see something like extremely interesting, so the reason why we got into NFTs is because we genuinely believe that, hey, everything will be tokenized. A lot of things in the world are non-fungible. So things like, I don't know, mortgages and like houses and collectibles and all of this stuff will be tokenized as NFTs, and we'll create the financial infrastructure. If that starts to happen, for whatever reason, right? It could be just random stroke of luck and enough people there's enough critical mass for all of that to happen. And this is like what we're seeing, coming out in the next NFT wave, then yeah, we'll probably jump on it. But it will really depend, like, if it's just like some short-lived meta of like people just speculating on more NFTs, or if it's something that we think is more sustainable. Yeah,
It might be a spicy question, but on that subject, Collector Crypt has had quite big success in that area. RWA, Pokemon collectibles, NFTs. Do you think that is a flash in the pan, or would that be something that you could like integrate into Tensor?
Yeah, so funny story. So Collector Crypt, I think they're on Solana. There's this other company called Fidgetos, which is also building something similar, tokenized TCG. So when we open sourced all of our contracts and basically said, hey, everyone come build on us last year, I think, or 2 years ago. Fidgetos was one of those companies that decided to build on Tensor, right? They didn't want to write smart contracts. They didn't have the expertise. They didn't want to get hacked. And so they said, hey, we're just going to build on Tensor. Part of the fees actually go back to Tensor Foundation, and the other part goes to Fidgetos. That is like one of the visions that we always wanted to realize. Was we build the base layer, the protocol, and then we have a bunch of these front ends building interesting NFT applications. So in a way, we are still able to hopefully get lucky with Tensor. If the next big Fidgetos or I don't know, tokenized mortgage company decides to build on our protocols and they knock it out of the park, then that's a win for us.
So you talk about the tokenization of real world assets coming as you see it. And I kind of thought that might happen, but if you get, for example, something like Genius Act now passing, and then you get the regulatory frameworks in place, and you get the ramping up and the scaling of protocols, well, not just Solana and Ethereum, but Cardano, XRP, all of them use case specific in a context. How do you still see, and that provides the monetary governance that secures an asset well and allows you the equivalence to trade it with a lot less friction and a lot more liquidity without an NFT, how do you still so how do you still see tokenization as having a place, given the fact that we're moving in a direction where we're getting governance with fiat currencies?
Are you asking if tokenization is relevant given?
Yeah, I mean, how do you see it? Like, I mean, you see that coming? How? Like, I'm just trying to understand it. Like, how does that fit? Because,
Yeah.
I mean, if you have a marketplace for a house, you've got the price and you've got a JPEG of the house. I mean, you've got a picture of the house, you've got a value that's now a bit more secure, right? In the governance context. Why?
Yeah, so maybe to talk about that specific house example, I'm not sure I know enough about the statutory things happening in the US to speak on like how that interacts with this. But the way that I see why you would tokenize a house on chain and why that's useful, it really comes down to like financial innovation that can happen around the tokenization of that house. So right now, if you try to so there are these companies that, for example, fractionalize a house and let people buy a piece of a house and therefore get direct revenue stream from that house. But the issue of all of this is, one, these quote unquote like Web2 fractionalization companies, they have to figure out how to get the liquidity in order to buy that house upfront and then fractionalize it out to individual investors. There's also a lot of regulatory hurdles that they jump, right? Like only US investors can invest in these houses in the US. If we're from Canada, we can't actually invest in these companies until they get the right licenses in Canada and then eventually the UK and all these other governments. I see tokenization as almost like a backdoor to that process. It's similar to what happened with stablecoins, where now you can transmit, $1 million to someone overseas in less than a fraction of a second. But you would never be able to do that in the traditional financial system because it's just so regulatorily. You can imagine the same thing happening with RWAs, where houses, you can now take out a massive loan on chain without having to talk to a banker and do that without asking for permission, right? So I think it's just, it lets you do a lot more interesting things financially with these assets when they're talking.
So do you think it just perhaps simplifies the process? Like you mean right now selling a house, put it on the market, you've got all kinds of processes, you maybe simplify that.
Yeah, I mean, I think just buying and selling a house is the least interesting part. I think it's everything downstream of it. So being able to collateralize it, take out a loan on it. If you have a tokenized Rolex, you could take out $10,000 if it's worth $40,000 without ever having to find some random sketchy loan shark.
That makes a lot more sense actually.
Yeah. But
it's kind of a touch-on question I have, but this is a question I like to ask everyone. Do you see regulation in crypto as a positive or a negative?
I think that answer is nuanced, at least for me. I think it is good if regulation clarifies what is legal and what is illegal. What happens is all the bad actors, now they know that hey, if I do this, there's clear guidelines for it, and I'm not within the guidelines, then I'll be arrested. There are actually a lot of shady actors in crypto who do a bunch of sketchy things like holding on to users' funds even though they claim they're non-custodial. That just doesn't fly under clear defined regulation, right? And that prevents all of these bad actors. Maybe if they're not bad, but they're just they're clumsy. They get hacked. That's a cost to the entire industry, right? $1 billion gets hacked. That makes front page of the Wall Street Journal. It's bad in the sense that if it becomes too burdensome and there's too many layers of regulation, then it's very difficult for two guys in a Staples office to build a crypto company anymore, right? See, that's exactly the state of finance right now, where you can't just start a bank anymore. But you could back in the 1800s when there was no regulation.
So I want to tie on to the question to more of that regarding tokenization and regulation. So I'm looking at Gulf, Dubai, Saudi, they have tokenization has been gaining traction. They're 3-4 companies right now already tokenizing assets. In Canada, you have tech, but over-regulation is just stifling innovation. So that's my comment of
of balancing regulation at the same time, allowing the company innovation to happen.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah, Canada actually is probably more on the aggressive side when it comes to regulation, or actually when it comes to enforcement. Canada tends to be more conservative in a lot of respects, right? The US was basically on par with Canada, but they've definitely relaxed since the last administration. So Canada arguably is like much worse than a lot of Western countries right now. Yeah, but that being said, like I wouldn't don't do anything illegal. Don't hold on to users' funds. There are enough opportunities in crypto where you don't have to worry about regulation. It's the same thing with building a Web2 company. You don't have to get a banking license if you're not building a Stripe. Actually, Stripe doesn't even have banking licenses. You don't have to just pick and choose your battles, right? If you're a hardcore regulatory guy who has a lot of experience, talking to the right people, then maybe you go down that route. But if you're someone who's fresh out of school but really talented and knows how to code and knows how to build product, then you might look somewhere else in space, right? Okay, shall we finish up the presentation?
Let's finish.
Okay, I'm gonna blitz through it because I have 5 minutes left. Okay, so we pivoted. Market was bad. Built Vector. Vector in one of the peak days basically took over, was way more than the entire NFT market combined. I want to jump to 3 takeaways when it comes to deciding and going through the process of pivoting. I'm going to talk in memes for 3 slides or 4 slides. Hopefully, it's more fun to look at memes. Lesson number 1 is you want to ask yourself, can you control your destiny? Like I said before, market size is probably the only thing that you cannot control as a startup. Everything else you should absolutely try and terraform to your will, because that's how you win as a startup. If you realize that even though you've built an amazing product, you've executed well, you have a brilliant team, and everyone's locked in, but your market size is $10 million and it's not growing, and you're the market leader, then it's probably time you consider doing something else or pivoting. Lesson number 2, once you've decided to pivot, even though communication to stakeholders is hard, it's very important to get right. So there are 4 levels to this, right? Level 1 is, hey, you're going to tell your team about the pivot, and there's no discussion. You basically just use hard power and say, this is, we as founders decided that we're going to pivot, and all of you are in for the ride. You're going to lose a ton of trust, and chances are, maybe 90% of your team will resign. Level 2 of that is you actually ask your team for feedback and try to get their concerns as soon as you make that decision to pivot. You effectively want to hear you want to get basically an unbiased take, a third-party take of what are some what's the devil's advocate case of why you guys should pivot. And you might actually come up with some interesting insights that you've never thought about, that your team maybe has thought about, and that maybe changes your decision ultimately. The third level of that is to loop them into the pivot process. So an anecdote here is when we decided to pivot from Tensor to Vector, we actually had a offsite scheduled around the same time. This was shortly after our token launch, and so we wanted to take a 3-day break for everyone to go hang out on a beach, just to relax and get to know each other in person. We ended up turning that offsite into a brainstorming session, and basically the place where we broke the news that, hey, we don't think the NFT market is there. We're considering a pivot, and we want to get you guys looped into the process. And what turned out to be, a 1-hour brainstorming session that we scheduled on the Saturday, turned out into basically a half a day session where there were so many ideas coming at us. There were so many ideas coming at us that a lot of them turned out to be great ideas that ultimately made or broke the product. So it's really important, 1, to loop in your team to get more interesting insights or feedback, but also get buy-in so that they don't quit on you and you effectively are back to pick off that team. And then the 4th level is just don't have a team at all. If you have not reached PMF, don't hire people. You should optimize your founding team to be self-sufficient, to build your first product, to go to market with it, and get to PMF. And then afterwards, you might consider hiring, team members to delegate work to. And then final lesson is, once you decide, you should commit. The thing here is, it's very hard to focus on two things at once. You have to commit to the new thing and basically drop all obligations and attachment to your old thing. So when we pivoted from Tensor to Vector, we basically said, we're not even going to work in the marketplace anymore. We're not going to add new features. We're not going to go and try to get more creators to launch on our launchpad. We're going to put it in maintenance mode, have a dev spend 2 hours a week fixing bugs, and that's it. Right? Just keep it alive so that it keeps generating money for us so that we can focus on this new thing Vector. The most valuable resource as a founder is your mindshare. You can't spend time thinking about two things at once. You'll end up doing a shit job at both. And so it's really important that you try to focus your entire mindshare on the one thing that's going to make or break your company. And then the last thing I want to leave you guys with is, it never feels right to make these tough decisions. You will always over-rationalize it and come up with a pros and cons list that are equally long. But at the end of the day, I think the best way to make a decision when you are in that scenario where it's a tough decision is to trust your gut. Surprisingly, evolution has made us quite good at making good decisions based on raw intuition and gut. And if you feel like you are dreading, waking up every day, going to your laptop and working on a product that doesn't grow and has 10 users, then it probably means you should do something else and pivot. So yeah, that was my presentation.
A question, if you have 1 minute, I guess you said don't hire until you have to. Who was your first hire and why?
We hired someone who was actually an active community member of us. He had been using the product since we launched in private beta. And we hired him because we were just getting too many. So we hired him for BD. We were getting too many DMs that was taking away time from us when it came to building the product. And basically time from building the product. And so that, we knew we could delegate this out to someone who was relatively deep in the ecosystem and can talk to people. And he would deal with all the calls that were coming in with creators, collections asking for updates to their collection page, partners that were reaching out to do partnerships with. Yeah. So maybe another rule of thumb is you should hire people if that meant you would have more time doing the thing that you're best at, or the thing that is the most crucial to your product succeeding. In our case, it was giving us back more time to build it.
No more questions. Okay, well, between Richard and Z, previous hackathon winner, grand champion hackathon winner, you have all the knowledge in here to become the winners. I want 20 nations to play next month. Sounds good. Thank you.